You've probably heard that ancient humans only worked about 15 hours a week, that they had it easy, a few hours of hunting, then leisure. It's one of the most repeated facts about prehistory, and it's wrong. Not because they worked more than that on food. They didn't. It's wrong because of what that number left out. Every tool that had to be made, every hide scraped, every nut cracked, every load of firewood and water carried. Every child watched. Count all of it, and your ancestors worked about as much as you do. The difference was never how much. It was what the work felt like. So let's take the day apart properly, hour by hour, and find out what actually filled it. First, where that famous number came from, because it wasn't invented. In the 1960s, anthropologists went to live with hunter-gatherer groups and did something nobody had done before. They measured. They followed people around and recorded how long things took. And the results were genuinely startling for the time. The researcher Richard Lee, working with the Jew, hoansi of the Kalahari, found that people spent something in the range of 15 to 20 hours a week acquiring food. That finding landed like a bomb because it demolished an assumption everyone had been carrying. That life before agriculture was a desperate scramble, a constant hungry struggle from dawn to dark. The anthropologist Marshall Sahlins gave the idea a name. That stuck. The original affluent society. Not affluent because they had much, but affluent because their wants were modest and easily met, leaving a great deal of time over. It's a beautiful idea. It's also incomplete. And the incompleteness is the interesting part, because acquiring food is not the same as feeding yourself. Look at what happens after the food arrives. A nut has to be cracked, and some of the ones our ancestors relied on are brutally hard. Hours of steady pounding with a stone against a stone for a pile of kernels that a modern person would eat in a sitting without noticing. Roots need cleaning and pounding. Meat needs butchering, which is skilled, physical work in itself. And a hide, if it is ever going to become clothing or a container or a covering, needs scraping clean of every scrap of tissue, then stretching, then working over with fat, and hands and tools across days until the stiff, drying skin finally turns soft, a process so laborious that in many societies it was effectively a full-time occupation for someone. Grain, once it entered the picture, needed grinding, and anyone who has looked at the deep-worn hollows in ancient grinding stones is looking at thousands of accumulated hours pressed into rock. None of that is acquiring food. All of it is work, and a great deal of it is longer, duller, and more repetitive than the hunting that gets all the attention. Then there's the equipment, and here the accounting gets worse. Every single tool your ancestors used, they made themselves. A good stone blade takes real skill and real time to strike, and then it dulls with use, and then it chips, and then it breaks, and then the whole process starts again. Wooden shafts warp and need straightening over heat. Bindings loosen and fray. Nets and baskets and cordage have to be twisted out of plant fiber by hand, fiber by fiber, hour after hour, and they wear out and need replacing. There is no shop, no spare, and no replacement that ever arrived from anywhere else. Every object in that camp existed because a person sat down and made it, and then kept maintaining it until it finally fell apart. Then, the invisible labor that keeps any settlement alive. Firewood enough to burn all night, gathered every day, from a radius that gets further out the longer you stay. Water, carried, often a long way. The camp itself, built and repaired. And children, watched constantly, in an environment with a great many ways to hurt a child. Add all of that to the 15 hours, and the picture changes completely. When later researchers went back and counted total work, everything, not just food acquisition, the figures came out much higher, and much closer to the length of a modern working week than the original headline suggested. So, the myth is dead, and it deserves to be. Your ancestors were not lounging around in a permanent holiday. They worked hard, most days, for most of their lives. Which means the real question was never, how many hours? It's what was the shape of the day? And that shape is genuinely, deeply different from yours. Start with waking, because it starts differently. There is no hour. That sounds obvious, and it isn't, because it means something you have never experienced. Nobody in that camp, or anywhere on Earth knows what time it is. There is no time to know. There is light and heat and hunger and how you feel, and that is the entire set of information available for deciding when to get up. So waking is gradual. People surface over a long stretch of the morning rather than all at once. Some are up before light and gone. Others are still lying down, talking, an hour after sunrise. Nobody is late because there is nothing to be late for. The day doesn't start at a particular moment. It gradually assembles itself. Then the work of getting food, and it tends to happen in the cooler part of the day for the obvious reason. Gathering parties leave, often in groups, often the same people together, and they walk, sometimes for hours to places they know, because the landscape is not wilderness to them. It's a familiar territory with a mental map of what's ripe, where, and when. Hunting is more irregular, sometimes long, sometimes unsuccessful, frequently returning empty-handed, which is why gathered food carried most of the calories most of the time in many groups. And here's a detail worth pausing on. That work is a conversation. People forage in company, talking the entire time, with children present, learning by being there. There is no separation between the work, the social life, and the education of the next generation. All three are the same activity. Then, the middle of the day, which in hot climates is simply not worked. It's too hot to be productive and dangerous to exert yourself. So the camp rests dozing, sitting in shade, talking, grooming, minor repairs. Not a scheduled break, just the obvious response to the sun being overhead. The afternoon is when much of the real labor happens, back at camp. And it's the part nobody pictures, when they imagine prehistoric life. This is the processing, the pounding, the scraping, the twisting of fiber into cord, the sharpening and rehafting and patching, and the endless quiet maintenance of every object the group owns. It's repetitive, it takes hours, and crucially, it is done sitting in a group, talking, with everyone's hands busy on their own separate task. Picture a loose circle of people around a shaded work area, one scraping a hide, one napping stone, one twisting cordage, one grinding, all of them talking continuously about nothing in particular, with children moving between them, watching, picking things up, trying it badly, being corrected without ceremony, and trying again. That is what most of an ancient afternoon actually looked like. And it is worth noticing that it contains, at the same time, the economy, the social life, and the entire education system of that society, none of which anyone thought to separate from the others. And then the sun goes down, and the day changes into something else entirely. This is the part I find most striking, because we can say something specific about it. The anthropologist Polly Weissner studied conversation among the Jew hoansi and did something clever. She compared what people talked about during the day with what they talked about at night around the fire. The daytime conversation was practical. Economic matters, land, complaints, arguments, gossip about who did what. The ordinary business of coordinating a group. At night, by firelight, it changed almost completely. The overwhelming majority of nighttime conversation was stories. Not planning, not disputes, not logistics, not any of the practical business that had filled the daylight hours. Stories about people, about journeys, about ancestors and distant relatives. And things that happened long ago and far away, told by people who were genuinely good at telling them, to a group who had heard many of them before and wanted to hear them again. Think about what that actually means, because it is easy to skim past as a charming detail, and it is much more than that. Firelight did something no other technology had ever done. It extended the day into hours that could not be used for work, hours that for every other animal on Earth were simply dark and over. And what humans chose to fill those hours with, night after night, in every group, everywhere, for tens of thousands of years, was narrative. That is where the shared knowledge lived. The map of the wider social world. Who was related to whom, 3 valleys away, and how. The rules, and what happened to people who broke them. The memory of individuals who had died before the youngest listeners were born. The accumulated sense of who we were and how we came to be here. None of it was written down anywhere. and all of it had to be transmitted intact to the next generation or it would vanish in a single lifetime. Evening was not leftover time or idle time. It was the hours in which a culture reproduced itself, and it ran entirely on stories told in the dark. Now step back and look at the whole day at once, because 4 differences separate it from yours, and none of them are about ours. The first is that the day was task-oriented, not clock-oriented. Work ended when the thing was finished, not when a number was reached. You cracked nuts until there were enough nuts, and then you stopped, and the stopping was decided by the nuts, rather than by an agreement made in advance by someone else. There was no concept of putting in time, because there was no time to put in, and nobody to put it in for. That single difference changes the entire psychological relationship between a person and their labor, and it is almost impossible for us to feel from the inside. The second is variety. Nobody did one thing. In a single ordinary day, a person might walk several miles, dig, carry, cut, pound, weave, repair a tool, and mind a child using different muscles, different skills, and different parts of their attention, switching between them as the day required. Deep specialization, doing one narrow task repeatedly for years on end, until you are very good at it and nothing else, is an invention of the last few thousand years. It is an extreme departure from what human beings actually did for hundreds of thousands of years before that. The third is that work was social. Almost nothing was done alone. The labor happened inside a continuous conversation with people you had known your entire life, and the talking wasn't a break from the work. It was simultaneous with it. The fourth is that the work was visible and finished. You could see the thing you had made. You could eat the food you had gathered. The distance between effort and result was short enough to hold in your hand, which is a psychological condition most modern work simply cannot offer, because so much of it feeds into systems whose end you'll never see. Now, the honest part, because this is where these videos usually go wrong. None of this means their lives were better than yours. That has to be said clearly. Infant mortality was high enough that losing children was a normal experience. A broken bone could end you. An infected wound could end you. Hunger was a real and recurring possibility, not a metaphor. And a bad season had consequences. No amount of clever foraging could fix. Almost everyone watching this would trade back within a week, and would be right to. But the texture of the day is a separate question from the safety of the life, and on that narrow question, the comparison is not flattering to us. They worked about as many hours. They just did it in daylight of their own choosing, at tasks that changed constantly, among people they loved, on things they could see the end of, and then they spent the whole evening telling each other stories. So come back to tomorrow. You already know when tomorrow starts, because something decided that in advance and you agreed to it. You know roughly where you'll be, and for how long, and what will be expected of you while you're there. Most of your hours are already allocated, and most of the allocation wasn't yours to make. You'll likely do one kind of task, repeatedly, largely alone, on something that feeds into a process whose completion you will never actually witness. And in the evening, the hours firelight once bought for stories, you'll probably be looking at a screen. Your ancestors didn't have more free time than you. That was never the difference. The difference is that they never had to divide their life into the part where they were working and the part where they were living, because for them, there was no line to draw. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, and about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that is something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.